I heard it before I saw it. A deep, wet breathing just beyond the circle of our fire, as though some great chest labored inches from the dark. The night insects had fallen silent without my noticing when the smell came. Rank, matted fur and something coppery, almost metallic. The horses shivered against their tethers. Then a shadow blotted the stars between the ironbarks, far too high for any man. Men have pressed me in the years since to set these events in order, though I confess I share them with reluctance. If you would hear more such accounts, you may lend your support, offer your approval, and set down your thoughts below, as one might annotate a curious report in a gentleman's library. To understand what we encountered, I must return to the winter of 1897, when the colony still spoke more of gold than of ghosts. I was then 29 years of age, a surveyor in the employ of the New South Wales Department of Lands, dispatched to assist in mapping the upper reaches of the Cowmung River and the wild country that lay west of Katoomba. There was talk in Sydney of a possible stock route, perhaps even a rail extension one distant day, and the minister wished for accurate charts rather than the vague sketches that had served bushmen and drovers. We left Katoomba on the 11th of July, 1897. Our party numbered 4 Europeans and 2 Gundungura men engaged as guides. There was myself, Arthur Ellison, trained in London and lately settled in the colony; Captain James Henderson, formerly of the Royal Engineers, who commanded the expedition; Thomas Briggs, a taciturn bushman whose knowledge of the ranges was said to be second to none; and young William Carter, scarcely 20, serving as assistant and chainman. Our equipment was unremarkable for the time: a theodolite, survey chains, plane table, compasses, field glasses, aneroid barometer, canvas tents, kerosene lanterns, a box camera with glass plates, and provisions for 4 weeks: flour, tea, salt beef, tobacco, and ammunition for our Martini Henry rifles. I remember the weight of the instrument box on my shoulder as we descended the first spur, the air growing sharper and cleaner with every step away from the soot and smoke of the town. The Gundungura men, Harry and his younger cousin, whom Henderson called simply Joe, moved ahead with an ease I envied, reading the country as one might read a familiar book. They spoke little English, though Harry understood more than he let on. From the outset, there was a reserve about them, a watchfulness when their gaze strayed towards the deeper gullies. On our second day, as we followed a narrow ridge thick with scribbly gum and wattle, I heard a call far off to the south. It was a long, rising howl that put me in mind of a dingo, yet it ended in a guttural note I had not heard from any dog or wild thing. I remarked upon it to Briggs. "Dingo," he said at once, without looking up from his horse's ears. Harry, walking beside me, glanced back over his shoulder towards the sound. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Not dingo," he said quietly. "Burunya." Henderson, riding just ahead, turned in his saddle. "What is that, Harry?" he asked, his tone brisk. Harry shrugged as though regretting the word. "Old fella, big fella, long hair. He lived there." He gestured with his chin towards the blue haze that lay over the distant ranges. Henderson smiled in that way educated men have when confronted with native law. "A spirit," he said to me aside. "They people these hills with all manner of bogies." I confess I shared his amusement then. I had read in some missionary tract of the wild men and hairy devils of Aboriginal legend, and had consigned them to the same shelf in my mind as the dragons of Europe. Had I understood the warning in Harry's eyes, I might have counselled a different course. The first week passed in the ordinary discomforts of bush travel. We followed ridgelines where we could, dropping into gullies only when forced by cliffs or impassable scrub. The nights were bitter, the frost whitening our blankets and stiffening the canvas of the tents. By day, I took bearings with the theodolite, sighting on distant peaks and marking our progress upon the plane table, while Carter called out the chain lengths in a clear, eager voice. The country was beautiful in a severe fashion. Deep ravines choked with tree ferns, sandstone escarpments glowing orange in the late sun, creeks tumbling over boulders polished by ages of water. There was a sense always of vastness, of a land that did not care whether men measured it or not. It was on the 8th day that we came upon the first tracks. We had descended into a narrow valley where a small creek wound between stands of casuarina and black wattle. The soil there was dark and damp, holding impressions with unusual clarity. Briggs, who had gone ahead to find a crossing, called back to us. "See here," he said, squatting by the water's edge. In the mud were a series of prints, perhaps a dozen in all, crossing the creek from east to west. At first glance, I thought them the tracks of a man walking barefoot, yet they were larger than any human foot I had seen, at least 14 inches from heel to toe, and broad. The toes were splayed, with a distinct impression of a big toe set almost in line with the others, not set back as in an ape's hand. "Some black fellow with big feet," Henderson said, after a moment's study. "Perhaps he carries a load. The weight would spread the toes." Briggs shook his head slowly. "Too heavy," he said. He pressed his own boot beside one of the prints, and the mud barely yielded. The mysterious track, by contrast, was sunk deep. "Ground is firm. Whoever made that is a big bugger." Carter, who had been uncharacteristically silent, swallowed audibly. "Could it be a bear, sir?" he asked. He had grown up in England and had not yet grown accustomed to the absence of such creatures in Australia. "There are no bears here, lad," Henderson replied. "No large ground ape either, despite what some of the penny papers print to amuse the public. No, most likely an illusion of the mud. See how the water has blurred the edges." He spoke with such assurance that I felt my own misgivings subside. Yet Harry, standing a little apart, would not cross the creek until Henderson ordered him sharply. As he stepped over the track, he muttered something in his own tongue, a short phrase repeated 3 times, like a charm against misfortune. That night, as we sat by the fire, Carter produced a small tin of tobacco he had been saving. He offered it around with a shy pride. "From my mother," he said, when I remarked upon the good quality. "She sent it from home. Said it would keep me company when the bush grew too quiet." He smiled then, a boyish, open expression that sat strangely upon his smoke-darkened face. "Do you miss England?" I asked. "Sometimes," he said. "The damp, mostly, and the sound of the trains. But there is more sky here. I want to save enough to bring her out. She has never seen a gum tree. I told her they smell of lemons when the rain comes." Henderson chuckled. "You had better make your fortune quickly, Carter. The bush is no place for a lady of years." Carter stared into the fire. "I shall manage it, sir," he said. "Once this work is done, there is talk of a position with the rail survey. They say the line may go west one day, all the way to the interior. I remember that moment with painful clarity now. The glow of the coals on his earnest face, the way he cradled the tin as though it were some fragile relic. It is one of the images that returns to me when sleep will not come. The next days brought further peculiarities, each small enough in itself to admit of rational explanation, yet together forming a pattern that troubled me. On the 10th day, as we traversed a high spur thick with banksia, we found a tree whose bark had been stripped in long, vertical gouges to a height of at least 10 feet. The marks were too wide and regular for possums or goannas, and there were no signs of an axe. The wood beneath was fresh and pale, as though the damage had been recent. "Lightning," Henderson suggested, though there was no sign of burning. "Men do this sometimes," Briggs said doubtfully, "to get at grubs, but I have not seen it so high." Harry refused to go near the tree. When I asked him why, he merely shook his head and said, "Burren ye climb there." Another night, our horses grew restless shortly after midnight, snorting and pulling at their tethers. I woke to the sound of hooves stamping the ground and the creak of leather. The moon was a thin, cloud-veiled sliver, casting little light. I took up my rifle and went to calm the animals. As I approached, a stone the size of a man's fist flew out of the darkness and struck the ground a few yards from my feet, sending up a spray of dirt. I froze, heart hammering. There was no cliff above from which it might have fallen. The ground there was flat, open for several yards before the scrub began. "Who is there?" I called, my voice sounding thin in the cold air. There was no answer. The bush loomed in silence. The horses trembled, their eyes rolling white. Henderson appeared at my side, his own rifle in hand. "What is it?" he asked. I gestured to the stone. He considered it, then the surrounding shadows. "Could have been dislodged by a wallaby," he said, "or rolled from some higher point. In this light one cannot judge the slope." He spoke quietly for the horses' sake, but I heard the uncertainty in his tone. We walked the perimeter of the camp together, lanterns swinging, rifles at the ready. We found nothing. No tracks, no sign of human or animal. When we returned to the fire, Harry was awake, sitting very still, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. "You heard it?" Henderson asked him. Harry nodded once. "What was it?" Harry's gaze did not waver. "He throws stone," he said. Henderson made an impatient sound. "You and your old man," he said. "Go back to sleep." Yet he did not sleep himself for some time after, and neither did I. The night seemed to press close about us, full of unseen watching. By the end of the second week, my initial skepticism had begun to fray, though I clung to it as a man clings to a familiar coat in a storm. Each oddity could be explained if one were willing to stretch one's reason a little further. We came then into a region of narrow, steep-sided valleys, where the sun reached the floor for only a few hours each day. Moss grew thick on the rocks, and the air held a constant chill, even at noon. The silence there was of a different quality, as though the usual sounds of the bush, bird calls, insect hum, the distant bark of dogs, had been muffled by some invisible hand. On the 17th day, we made camp beside a small, sluggish creek in one such valley. The banks were lined with tree ferns and tall, straight gums, whose upper branches vanished into the gloom above. A faint mist clung to the ground, smoking around our boots. That afternoon, I went a little upstream with the camera, hoping to capture something of the peculiar light beneath the canopy. As I arranged the frame on the tripod and set the plate, I heard, quite distinctly, the sound of someone walking in the undergrowth on the opposite bank. Heavy footfalls, spaced as though the walker had a long stride. "Briggs," I called, assuming he had come to fill the water bags. The footsteps ceased at once. There was no rustle of leaves, no crack of twig, only the soft gurgle of the creek. I waited a moment, then stepped to the water's edge and peered through the ferns. The opposite bank was empty. The undergrowth there was dense, but not so much that a man of Briggs's bulk could have hidden without some sign. I stood listening, scarcely daring to breathe. From somewhere above, high in the trees, came a low, almost conversational murmur, as of a voice speaking in a language I did not know. The sound rose and fell, with an odd, throaty quality. I could not distinguish words, only the cadence of speech. The hairs on my arms lifted. I felt suddenly that I was intruding upon a private exchange, that I was the subject of discussion. "Who is there?" I said, more sharply than I intended. The murmuring cut off. A moment later, something crashed away through the branches, moving with astonishing speed and power. Leaves and small twigs rained down on my side of the creek. I glimpsed, for the briefest instant, a dark shape swinging between trunks at a height no man could reach. Then it was gone. I returned to camp with a plate I knew would show nothing but blurred foliage. My hands shook as I replaced it in its case. When I told Henderson what I had heard, he frowned. "Echo," he said. "Sound plays tricks in these gullies. As for something in the trees, perhaps a large bird. You know the lyrebird can mimic human voices. I have heard one sound like a man chopping wood." "It was no bird," I said, more heatedly than was wise. "It spoke, or something like speech." Henderson's eyes rested on me for a moment. "You are tired, Ellison," he said at last. "We all are. Let us not start seeing bush devils in every shadow. We have work to complete." He was right about the fatigue. We had been in the field nearly 3 weeks by then, our clothes perpetually damp, our sleep broken by cold and strange noises. Yet, as I lay in my swag that night, listening to the slow drip of water from the leaves and the occasional distant crash of some unseen animal, I could not shake the conviction that there was something in that valley that watched us with a curious, assessing intelligence. The micro-shock, when it came, arrived not with some grand apparition, but with a small domestic horror that struck at the heart of our fragile sense of order. It was the following morning at first light. Carter, whose duty it was to rise early and tend the fire, gave a sudden, strangled cry that brought us all scrambling from our blankets. Our packs, which we had left neatly arranged beneath a tarpaulin the night before, were in disarray. The canvas had been pulled aside. Several bags lay open, their contents strewn upon the damp ground. Hard biscuits were scattered, some with great chunks bitten from them, the teeth marks deep and wide. A tin of salt beef had been crushed almost flat, as though by a tremendous hand. Our spare lantern, which had been carefully wrapped, lay a few yards away, its glass shattered. "Damnation," Henderson muttered, dropping to his knees to examine the damage. "Briggs, how could you let an animal into camp?" Briggs bristled. "I set the horses proper," he said. "No beast came near them. They would have raised the dead with their racket." "It was not a dingo," I said quietly, holding up the ruined meat tin. The metal bore 4 distinct impressions, like the pads of fingers. "Nor any native dog. Look at this." Briggs took it, his weathered face paling slightly as he traced the marks with a calloused thumb. "What in God's name has a grip like that?" he whispered. Harry stood at the edge of the disturbed area, his expression unreadable. "He hungry," he said. "He smell meat. You sleep in his place." "Whose place?" Henderson demanded, his temper fraying. "For the last time, man, there is no—" Before he could finish, a sound rolled down the valley, so sudden and so close that we all started as one. It began as a low moan, rising swiftly into a howl that seemed to vibrate in the very bones. There was a depth to it, a resonance, as if it issued from a chest of great size. It was not the cry of any dingo, nor of a man. It rose and fell in a pattern that suggested deliberation, almost as though it were calling or warning. The horses went wild, rearing and plunging against their tethers. Carter, eyes wide, clung to one's halter, murmuring nonsense to soothe it. Henderson's face had gone very still. "Into the trees," he said quietly. "Rifles. Now." We obeyed without question. There was no more talk then of birds or echoes. The sound had stripped away the last of our comfortable explanations, leaving only the raw nerve of fear. We spent that day in a state of strained watchfulness, moving with exaggerated care, speaking in low voices. Every crack of twig became a footstep, every shifting shadow a lurking form. The work of surveying, which had once occupied my full attention, became a mechanical duty performed by hands that trembled. By afternoon, we had climbed out of the valley onto a spur that offered a view of the surrounding country. The ranges rolled away in blue folds, the sky a hard, pale dome. In such vastness, our small fears might have seemed ridiculous. Yet the memory of that howl clung to us like a smell. That night, Henderson ordered double watches. He took the first himself, pacing the perimeter of the firelight, rifle in hand. I relieved him at midnight. The stars were bright, the Milky Way a river of light overhead. The bush around us lay in a darkness so complete it seemed almost physical. For an hour, perhaps more, all was still. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard a soft, purposeful tread, as of something large moving with care among the trees. The sound came closer, then stopped, just beyond the circle of light. "Who goes there?" I called, my voice cracking. "Briggs." "Is that you?" There was no answer. The horses shifted uneasily, their ears pricked. I felt the weight of eyes upon me. A smell reached me then, borne on a faint stirring of air, a heavy, musky odour, like that of a wet dog left too long in a closed room, mingled with a rank, almost sweet note that turned my stomach. It was not the smell of any animal I knew from farm or field. I raised the rifle, the barrel wavering slightly. My finger tightened on the trigger. From the dark, no more than a few yards away, came a sound that halted me. It was a low, rumbling growl, but there was something almost questioning in it, as though the creature, if creature it was, were as uncertain of me as I was of it. The growl rose, hovered on the edge of a wordless utterance, then fell away. My mouth had gone dry. My heart hammered so loudly, I feared it must be heard. "Show yourself," I managed. There was a long moment of silence. Then, slowly, I saw it. At the very edge of the firelight, between two ironbarks, a shape detached itself from the darkness. It was tall, taller than any man I had met, perhaps 7 feet, and broad across the shoulders. Its outline was that of a man, yet everything about it was exaggerated, as though drawn with a heavy hand. The head sat low between the shoulders, with no discernible neck. The arms were long, reaching almost to the knees. The whole form was covered in hair that caught the faint light, a dark, shaggy pelt. I could not see its face clearly, only the suggestion of a heavy brow and a flat plane where the nose should be. But I saw its eyes. They reflected the firelight with a dull, reddish gleam. Not like the sharp flash of a cat's eyes, but something deeper, as though the light had to travel farther to find a surface. We regarded one another across that small gulf of fire and shadow. Time seemed to stretch. My mind, that had catalogued trees and stones with such precision, gibbered uselessly, unable to fit this thing into any known category. Then, from within the camp, a log shifted and collapsed in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks with a sudden crack. I started, the rifle jerking in my hands. The creature flinched, its head turning sharply towards the noise. In that instant, I saw its profile, the jut of the jaw, the curve of the skull. It was neither ape nor man, but some uncomfortable midpoint that made my skin crawl. It moved then with a speed that belied its bulk, stepping back into the darkness and vanishing as though it had never been. There was a crashing of undergrowth, a heavy, loping stride that receded into the night, then silence. I stood there, rifle half raised, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I do not know how long I remained thus before Henderson's hand fell on my shoulder, making me start. "What did you see?" he asked. I realized then that my cry, when the log had cracked, must have woken the others. Briggs and Carter stood near the fire, rifles in hand, their faces pale. Harry was nowhere to be seen. I later learned he had slipped away into the trees at the first sound, as though unwilling to be between us and whatever approached. I saw... My voice failed. The words seemed inadequate. "A man," I said at last. "A very large, very hairy man." Henderson's jaw tightened. "Are you certain?" he asked. "As certain as I am of anything," I said. He looked towards the trees where I had pointed. There was nothing now but darkness and the faint, swaying silhouettes of leaves. "We break camp at first light," he said quietly. "We have seen enough of this valley." In the morning, the decision to withdraw took on the guise of practicality. Our supplies were dwindling faster than anticipated, owing to the loss of meat and the disturbance of our packs. The weather, too, seemed to threaten a change. Clouds had gathered on the western horizon, and the air held a metallic taste that spoke of coming rain. Yet beneath these reasons lay another unspoken one. We had come as men of science and engineering to measure and map. We found ourselves instead as intruders in a place that did not wish to be known. The journey back was not a simple retracing of our steps. Henderson, perhaps unwilling to admit even to himself that we were in retreat, chose a different route that would, on paper, connect our previous observations and complete the loop of our survey. In practice, it led us through country that grew wilder and more oppressive with each day. The phenomena that had begun as isolated curiosities now multiplied. We found more tracks, always in damp ground near water, always crossing our path rather than following it, as though the maker moved on its own business and we were of no great interest. Once, in a patch of sandy soil, we found the prints of a kangaroo, clear and undisturbed, and over them, fresh, the broad splayed tracks of the same unknown foot. The kangaroo's trail ended there. At night, we heard calls, sometimes distant, sometimes so near that the canvas of our tents trembled with the vibration. These were not all of one kind. Some were long, mournful cries that echoed along the ridges. Others were short, sharp barks, almost like a man coughing. Once, in the small hours, I woke to the sound of what I could have sworn was laughter, a low, chuckling sound that rose and fell in a way that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. The forest itself seemed to participate in our unease. There were places where the air grew suddenly colder, where no birds sang, and even the flies were absent. In such pockets, the silence pressed against the eardrums like a physical force. Passing through them, I felt as though I moved underwater, my limbs heavy, my thoughts sluggish. Our company, once held together by the routines of work and the small comforts of shared hardship, began to fray. Carter, who had been so eager, grew withdrawn. He started at every noise, his eyes darting constantly to the trees. More than once, I found him staring into the middle distance, lips moving soundlessly as though in prayer. Briggs, by contrast, grew irritable, snapping at small provocations. He insisted, loudly and often, that there was nothing in the bush that a bullet could not stop. Yet he kept his rifle within arm's reach even when he squatted to relieve himself. Henderson maintained an outward calm, but I saw the new lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his hand lingered on the hilt of his revolver. He spoke less, and when he did, it was of bearings and distances, as though the language of measurement could shield him from the encroaching irrational. Harry and Joe moved with a kind of resigned dread. They spoke more often to one another in their own tongue, their glances flicking to the ridgelines as though expecting to see some familiar, dreaded shape there. One evening, as we prepared to camp, Harry came to Henderson. "We go back quick way," he said, pointing eastwards, away from the line Henderson had marked. "Too much Burranya this way." "We are already going back," Henderson replied, with a patience that cost him an effort. "Your quick way will take us into country we have not charted. We could be lost for weeks." Harry shook his head. "You lost now," he said simply. "He follow. He angry." Henderson's jaw clenched. "We proceed as planned," he said. "You are engaged as guide, not as prophet." Harry's eyes met mine for a moment. There was a question there, and something like pity. Then he turned away. 2 nights later, the thing that had been stalking the edges of our perception stepped, for a brief and terrible moment, fully into our lives. We had made camp in a narrow saddle between 2 ridges, a compromise between the exposed heights and the oppressive gullies. The wind had risen, sighing through the casuarinas with a sound like distant surf. Low clouds scudded across the sky, obscuring the stars. After supper, we sat close to the fire, our faces ruddy, our backs chilled. Conversation had dwindled to monosyllables. The howl of some unseen beast drifted to us from far off, then another, answering from a different quarter. The calls crisscrossed the night, a web of sound that set my teeth on edge. "I have heard enough of that," Briggs muttered, rising. "I am going to see if I can spot the beggar." "Stay within sight of the fire," Henderson said sharply. Briggs waved a hand in acknowledgement and moved off a few yards, his silhouette soon merging with the shadows. I watched him raise his rifle, peering into the darkness. The wind dropped suddenly, as though some great breath had been drawn in. The night sounds ceased. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly. "Briggs," I called, unease prickling. There was no answer. "Briggs, do not play the fool," Henderson said, rising. He had taken only a step when a sound split the air, a cry that began as a shout of surprise and twisted mid-utterance into a scream of such raw terror that it seemed to tear something in my chest. It cut off abruptly, as though a hand had been clapped over the mouth. We froze. For an instant, no one moved. Then Henderson was running, rifle in hand, towards the place where Briggs had vanished. I followed, my own legs carrying me before my mind had fully decided. We found his rifle first, lying on the ground, the barrel bent at a slight, unnatural angle. A yard beyond, the scrub was crushed, leaves torn, branches snapped. There was no sign of Briggs himself. "Briggs!" Henderson shouted, his voice cracking. "Answer, man!" From somewhere ahead came a low, snarling grunt, followed by a heavy thud and the crashing of undergrowth, as of something large moving rapidly uphill. We plunged after, stumbling, branches whipping our faces. The beam of Henderson's lantern swung wildly, throwing mad shadows. The ground rose steeply. I slipped, my boots skidding on loose stones, and went to one knee. As I pushed myself up, the lantern's light fell upon a patch of bare earth. There, smeared across the soil and the lower leaves of a sapling, was a dark streak that could be nothing but blood. I stared at it, my mind refusing, for a heartbeat, to accept the simple fact. "Here!" I called hoarsely. Henderson joined me, his face grim. He touched the stain with 2 fingers, then held them up. Even in the weak light, the colour was unmistakable. "We go back," Harry said behind us. I started. I had not heard him approach. He stood a few yards away, Joe at his shoulder, both holding spears they had cut from saplings. "No good. He'd take him. You go back now." "We do not leave a man," Henderson said, his voice low and dangerous. "We search." Harry shook his head slowly. "You find only more blood," he said. "He'd take him up there." He pointed towards the dark bulk of the ridge above. "That his place. You go, he'd take you too." "Damn your stories," Henderson snapped. "Briggs is my responsibility. I will not abandon him on the word of—" A roar rolled down from the ridge then, so loud and close that it seemed to make the very air vibrate. It was like the howl we had heard before, but magnified, enraged. There was a note in it that I can only describe as triumphant. In that sound was the simple, brutal announcement of a hunter who has taken his prey. For a moment, we all stood rooted. The rationale part of my mind, that had clung to talk of dingoes and echoes, died then. Whatever made that sound was not any animal known to science. It was something that walked on 2 legs, that could bend iron, that could carry a full-grown man uphill in seconds. Henderson's shoulders sagged, very slightly. "We fall back," he said. The words dragged from him. "We are in no state to pursue in the dark. At first light, we will reassess." We returned to camp in a silence broken only by our laboured breathing and the crackle of the fire. Carter sat where we had left him, his face white, eyes huge. "Where is he?" he whispered. Henderson did not answer at once. He poured a measure of rum from the medical chest and handed it to the boy. "Drink," he said. Carter swallowed obediently, the liquid slopping onto his shirt. "Briggs is missing," Henderson said then, his voice carefully even. "We will organize a search at dawn. For now, we keep the fire high and the watches double. No one goes beyond the light." He did not mention the blood. None of us did. The fact of it hung in the air between us, unspoken, heavy. That night was the longest of my life. The fire seemed a feeble thing, a small circle of human defiance in an ocean of black. Every gust of wind became a footstep, every crack of ember a breaking twig. At one point, near dawn, I heard, from somewhere just beyond the reach of the light, a soft, wet tearing sound, followed by a low, satisfied grunt. I sat rigid, every muscle screaming, and did not move. We searched at first light, fanning out along the ridge where we had heard the roar. We found more blood on rocks and leaves, in smears and drops that told of something dragged. We found, caught on a low branch, a strip of cloth that matched the colour of Briggs's shirt. We did not find his body. The tracks, such as we could discern them, led into a tangle of boulders and dense scrub that rose towards a cliff face. There, they vanished upon stone. "We mark his passing here," Henderson said at last, his voice hoarse. He stood with his hand on the rock, head bowed. "We will inform his people when we return." Carter made a strangled sound. "That is all?" he said. "We leave him to that?" Henderson's eyes flashed. "What would you have us do, Mr. Carter?" he asked. "Climb into that warren and offer ourselves up one by one. We are 4 men now, with limited ammunition, in hostile country. Our first duty is to the living." He was right, of course. In later years, when I have judged that decision, I have found no alternative that did not end in more crosses on lonely hills. Yet the memory of turning away from that place, leaving whatever remained of Briggs to the mercy of the unknown, has never ceased to trouble me. From that point, our journey ceased to be an expedition and became a flight. Henderson abandoned any pretense of charting new ground. We took the most direct line he could calculate towards the settled country, even when it meant scrambling down near vertical slopes or forcing our way through almost impenetrable scrub. We traveled longer hours, spoke less, ate sparingly. The thing, or things, that haunted those ranges did not let us go easily. On the second day after Briggs's disappearance, as we crossed a narrow creek, a boulder the size of a small cart splashed into the water a few yards upstream, sending a wave that drenched us to the waist. We stared up at the cliff above. There was no sign of movement, no likely perch from which it could have fallen. The rock itself was of a different composition to the surrounding stone, as though it had been carried there. That night, something moved around our camp with a boldness that suggested we were being tested. We heard the heavy footfalls circling, just beyond the firelight, the crack of branches under considerable weight. At one point, a hand, or something like a hand, pressed against the outside of my tent, the canvas bowing inward a full foot. The shape was broad, with long fingers that spread and flexed, feeling the thin barrier between us. I lay there, scarcely daring to breathe, every fibre of my being screaming to flee, yet paralyzed by the knowledge that there was nowhere to run. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the pressure lifted, the footsteps receded. From the darkness came a series of low, rumbling sounds, almost like speech. Another voice answered, higher, with a questioning note. For a moment, I had the wild impression of a family discussing us, weighing our threat, our interest. The conversation ended with a short, barking grunt. The night swallowed the sounds. In the grey light before dawn, we found, in the soft earth near the ashes of the fire, a single print, clearer than any we had seen. It was enormous, the toes splayed, the heel deep. Beside it, half obliterated, was the smaller print of a similar kind. 2 of them, Carter whispered. At least 2. Perhaps more, I said, before I could stop myself. Henderson stared at the track for a long moment. Then he knelt, took from his pocket a small notebook, and made a careful sketch, adding measurements with meticulous precision. His hand did not tremble. "You are recording it?" I asked, surprised. "I am an officer of engineers," he said. I record what I see. Whatever this is, it is part of this country. It may be of interest to men better qualified than we to judge its nature." His tone was controlled, but I saw the muscle jumping in his cheek. We left that place with an almost superstitious haste, as though the act of looking too long at the print might call its maker back. At last, after what felt like an eternity of ridges and gullies, we came upon signs of the world we had left. A faint track, the remains of an old timber getter's route, cut across our path. A few miles beyond, we saw smoke on the horizon that did not belong to bushfire, but to some human dwelling. We stumbled into a small selection late that afternoon, looking, I am sure, like men returned from the dead. The selector, a wiry fellow with a suspicious eye, stared as we approached. "Where in blazes have you come from?" he asked. "From the west," Henderson said shortly. "We have been engaged in survey work. We require directions to the nearest town and the use of your telegraph if you have one." The man shook his head. "No telegraph here," he said. "Nearest is Oberon. You look like you have seen the devil himself." At that, Carter gave a short, hysterical laugh that turned quickly into a sob. He sank onto a stump, his shoulders shaking. "We have been in rough country," Henderson said. "We lost a man. The Rangers took him." The selector spat thoughtfully. "They do that," he said. "You should not have gone in there. Blackfellas say there is something that walks those hills. Big, hairy bugger. My old woman reckons her uncle saw it once, near the Cowmong. Threw stones at him till he near pissed himself." He chuckled, as though at a good yarn. Henderson's face did not change. "Superstition," he said. "We will pay you for any provisions you can spare, and for the loan of a horse to carry a message." That night, under a roof for the first time in weeks, the sounds of the bush muted by slab walls, I lay awake, listening not to the calls of unknown beasts, but to the soft snoring of Carter in the next room and the occasional creak of the house settling. One might think that such sounds would be a comfort. Instead, they seemed fragile, temporary, like a thin veneer over something vast and indifferent. In Oberon and later in Bathurst, we became once more men among men. We bathed, shaved, put on clean clothes. The smells of civilization, smoke, sweat, horse, beer, wrapped around us. Yet I felt like an imposter, a ghost moving through a world that no longer quite fit. The formal report of our expedition was composed in Bathurst, in a small office lent to us by the Lands Department. Henderson and I sat at a table littered with maps and notes, the ticking of a clock loud in the quiet. "We must decide how to phrase the matter of Briggs," Henderson said, pen poised. "The truth," I said, "as near as we can state it." He looked at me over the rim of his spectacles. "And what is that truth, Mr. Ellison?" he asked. "That our man was carried off by a hairy giant that walks on two legs and howls at the moon. That I, an officer of Her Majesty's forces, failed to pursue the creature into its lair. That we, representatives of science and progress, fled like frightened children from old wives' tales made flesh." His words stung, not because they were unjust, but because they laid bare the humiliating gap between our self-image and our experience. "We can say that he was taken by some unknown animal," I said, more quietly. "That we heard calls unlike any we could identify. That we found tracks of unusual size and shape. We can attach your sketch." Henderson's mouth tightened. "If we do that," he said, Our report will be dismissed as the work of men who lost their wits in the bush. The minister will smile and file it away. Our professional reputations will be compromised. Any serious observations we have made regarding the terrain will be tainted by association with the fantastical. He looked down at the paper, the blank space where Briggs's fate awaited description. "If we do not," I said, "we consign the truth to oblivion." He was silent for a long moment. The clock ticked. At last, he dipped his pen. "On the evening of the 23rd, he wrote, "while engaged in routine camp duties, Mr. Thomas Briggs' guide became separated from the party in the vicinity of a steep ridge. Despite immediate search, he could not be located. It is believed he fell or was taken by a wild animal into country too dangerous to traverse in the dark. Further search was rendered impracticable by the nature of the terrain and the limited resources of the party." He laid down the pen. "There," he said, "we have not lied. We have merely omitted certain speculative embellishments." "And the tracks?" I asked. He hesitated, then opened his notebook to the page with the drawing. For a moment, his fingers rested on the paper, as though reluctant to let it go. "We will append this," he said, "without comment. Let those who read it make of it what they will." In the event, few made anything of it at all. The official report, when printed, was received with polite interest in certain circles. Our observations on the feasibility of a stock route were discussed. The ruggedness of the country was noted. Briggs's death was regretted as an unfortunate but not uncommon occurrence in such work. When, in the smoking room of a Sydney club, I once ventured, in cautious terms, to mention the unusual tracks and the calls we had heard, an elderly gentleman of scientific bent smiled indulgently. "Bush fever, my dear fellow," he said. "You were exhausted, overwrought. The mind plays tricks. As for large, unknown bipeds, the notion is quite absurd. This is not Africa. Our fauna has been thoroughly catalogued." He sipped his port. "If such a creature existed," he added, "it would have been shot and mounted for the museum long ago." I said nothing. I had no desire to be thought a liar or a lunatic, yet the certainty with which he dismissed the possibility struck me then as oddly arrogant, given the vastness of the country beyond the thin line of settlement. Years passed. I married, had children, rose in my profession. I walked many more miles of bush, though never again so deep into that particular range. The events of 1897 receded, as all things do, into the background of a life. Yet they never entirely left me. There were nights, especially in the early years, when I would wake with my heart pounding, the echo of that roar still vibrating in my bones. For a moment, I would not know whether I lay in my bed in Parramatta or in a swag under the ironbarks, the smell of damp earth in my nostrils. The darkness of the room would seem alive, full of watching eyes. Certain sounds became triggers. Once, walking home along a quiet street, I heard, from a yard where a dog was chained, a long, rising howl. It was nothing like the calls in the ranges, yet my knees weakened, and I had to grip a fence post until the wave of memory passed. On another occasion, at a picnic in the Blue Mountains with my family, my youngest son ran laughing into a patch of scrub, disappearing for a moment from view. A ridiculous, paralyzing terror seized me. I was on my feet, calling his name in a voice I barely recognized before he emerged, puzzled, from behind a clump of ferns no more than 10 yards away. "Papa, what is wrong?" he asked. I could not tell him. How could I explain that in that instant I had seen, superimposed upon the sunlight and laughter, the image of a man's bent rifle lying in the dirt and the smear of blood on a leaf? Once, perhaps 10 years after the expedition, I encountered Henderson in Sydney. He had left the service and was employed in some private engineering concern. We met by chance in Martin Place, amid the clatter of carriages and the chatter of clerks. "Ellison," he said, with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "You are well?" "Well enough," I replied. We exchanged the usual civilities, spoke of families and work. There was a pause. "Do you ever think of it?" I asked, unable to stop myself. He knew at once what I meant. His gaze drifted, for a moment, beyond my shoulder, as though he saw not the sandstone facades and the passing crowd, but some distant, tree-clad ridge. "From time to time," he said. "Particularly when I hear some new tale of a Yahoo or Yowie in the newspapers. They have taken to calling it that now, have you noticed? As though giving it a name tames it." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I have sometimes wondered," he added, "whether we ought to have made more of our observations. Published something in a learned journal, perhaps." "Would it have changed anything?" I asked. He considered. "Perhaps not," he said. "Men believe what fits comfortably within their existing schemes. The rest they discard. In any case, I find I have less appetite now for unsettling the world." We parted with a handshake. As I watched him go, his shoulders a little more stooped than I remembered, I felt a strange kinship, as though we were members of some small, unwilling fraternity, bound by a knowledge we could neither fully share nor entirely bear alone. In my later years, as the 20th century advanced with its trains and telegraphs and aeroplanes, I took to reading, with a mixture of dread and fascination, any account I could find of strange creatures in the Australian bush. There were more than one might think. Stockmen spoke of hairy men glimpsed at dusk, crossing a creek in a few strides. Swagmen told of stones thrown at them from unseen hands. A timber worker near the Hawkesbury described a tall, shaggy figure that had watched him from the tree line for an hour, then melted away when he raised his axe. Most of these tales were delivered with a wink, a shrug, an invitation to share in the joke. Yet beneath the bravado, in some, I sensed the same tightness of the mouth, the same quick glance at the shadows that I had seen in my own shaving glass. Once, in a dusty second-hand bookshop, I came across a slim volume of folklore compiled by some earnest young anthropologist. In a chapter on the beliefs of the Gundungurra, there was a brief mention of a being called the Bourronnier, a large, hairy man of the bush who throws stones and steals food, and who punishes those who trespass upon certain places. The description was maddeningly vague. Yet the name on the page seemed to leap out at me, like an old acquaintance. I thought of Harry, standing at the edge of our camp saying, "He hungry, you sleep in his place." I have sometimes wondered whether what we met in those ranges was a single, rare creature, some throwback or relic of an earlier age, or whether the bush holds, still, a small population of such beings, living in the folds and shadows where men seldom go. If the latter, they have been remarkably adept at avoiding the full glare of our attention. Perhaps they are more intelligent than we allow. Perhaps they understand in some inarticulate way that to be fully known by us is to be trapped, killed, displayed. In my more fanciful moments, I have entertained another thought, that the land itself, in its vastness, throws up from time to time forms that do not fit neatly into our categories, as a reminder that our knowledge is partial, our dominion fragile. We draw our lines on maps, drive our rails, build our towns, and think we have tamed the continent. Yet beyond the last fence, in the deep gullies and on the high wind-scoured ridges, something old and patient moves, indifferent to our surveys. I am an old man now. My hands, that once held the theodolite steady, tremble as I write. The bush has changed. There are more roads, more wires strung across the sky. Yet there are still places where the trees close in and the light grows thin, where a man can feel very small. Sometimes, on still nights when the city's noise has ebbed, I sit by my window and listen. Most often, I hear only the distant rumble of a tram, the bark of a dog. But now and then, carried faintly on some wandering current of air, I seem to catch a sound that does not belong. A long, low call, rising and falling in a pattern that stirs an old, cold place in my chest. I tell myself it is a train whistle, distorted by distance. I tell myself many things. Yet in the quietest hours, when the mind ceases its busy rationalizations, what returns to me most vividly is not the roar on the ridge, nor the bent rifle, nor even the great shaggy form at the edge of the firelight. It is a smaller, more intimate detail, the feel of the earth under my palm that night, when something pressed against the canvas of my tent, the way the ground seemed to tremble very slightly with the slow, deliberate rhythm of its breathing. I think of that unseen chest rising and falling just beyond the thin fabric, and of the knowledge that there was, in that darkness, a presence that regarded me as I might regard some curious insect. And I know, with a certainty that has outlasted all my maps and measurements, that whatever walks in those ranges still breathes somewhere in the cold gullies where no survey line has yet been drawn.